Hello. Before we kick it off, just a heads up, live electricity is powering these lights and I'm not going to be discussing how to do them for your own safety. The Liger Zero Panzer. Stacked with an arsenal that could flatten a town in the blink of an eye and the looks to make any tank enthusiast immediately turn their heads. This big machine comes in at 145 tons, which sounds, very, very light, to be honest. So unless Z has some sort of funky gravity or something going on, there's no way it's this light, considering 2 Jagdtigers would weigh this much from World War II, and that doesn't make any sense. Anyway, moving on. As I was saying, it features a pair of twin hybrid cannons made up of a top 216mm railgun and a bottom 108mm beam gun, along with 12 missile pods and a few other heavy-hitting bits and pieces around it here and there. Growing up, this was always the coolest Liger to me, thanks to the love of tanks and all that, and it doubles as being the perfect subject for some tinkering and experimenting. In the timeline of wacky cauldron ideas I've thought up, this was actually the beginning experiment with LEDs, with the Schneider I did first being a bit of a proto-experiment for this exact build. And although the idea has continued, grown and branched off into further future projects, those aren't possible without doing this one first. Having bought the 2 Panzers used in this project over 2 years ago now, and started well over a year ago on the 4th of March 2024, I knew I wanted to use clear pieces from the Holotech Panzer to really illuminate some of the bits and bobs, and by the time I settled on doing just some of the missile tips, the idea snowballed and, well, before you knew it, it split up into 2 ideas, with this Panzer being one of them, and all of the things being lit up. The other idea I've cooked up with this tinkering though, that's going to be quite a bit later, so we'll talk about it then. Starting off with the developmental stage, I guess you could call it, I already had it mapped out that I would be doing a lot of soldering to make looms with the various LEDs for each section I planned to light up, and this was fairly tricky because I had to map the electrical side of things, and that was to ensure that the thickness of the wires linking all of the looms down to the power source like vanes was correct and would allow the power to flow without problems. And this created problems. To begin with, I was using a simple battery-powered connection to test the looms, which was fine, but the issue arose every time I connected all of the looms to the live network, coming in the form of some LEDs not powering on, or being quite dull, and to quickly check myself here, I quickly soldered a test loom of the same length LEDs and got the same results. With that not working, it was clear what was wrong when I sat for a second and ran it through my noodle, and that was too many LEDs on the same loop. Just kidding, that's also not the problem. I actually dialed the looms back to no more than 2 lights per connection and kept it at a maximum of 4 on each track, as it were, keeping it vague as I mentioned at the start, and basically this did absolutely bloody nothing, mate. So tossing the looms I'd painstakingly soldered aside, and deciding to go with individual cables since I'd tested it and that did indeed work, I ripped up several hours and destroyed several lights, changing this path. How I was to deal with the new idea meant another idea was needed, so I went a different direction and went in 4 head first, and I gotta tell you, the next problem was a stiff one to headbutt and it sucked so bad. Well, you see, the dumbass that I am, I went and zapper-capped all of the LEDs in place on the pieces, still on the sprue, and let them dry, and let me tell you, when I do things before I've had a coffee in the morning, it's usually pretty stupid. This was a terribly bad idea because the LEDs literally can't vent heat when you do this. So you bet after I went and spent another 6 hours or so fiddling and messing with the Panzer's section and feeding wires through and getting it all ready and didn't test it once, by the time it was ready and I turned it on for the first time, they all went out in a singular puff of smoke and smoldered. And I felt like an absolute monkey. Good thing this is all an experiment, am I right, guys? Now ready to take up smoking to help cope with the thick stupidity I'd laid upon myself, I had to sit down post-coffee consumption and said, right, this is what's up. Splitters, individual cables, extra cable length, PVA glue, and take as damn long as I need to make sure these damn lights work. And that first part was done. After getting the grumps on with the LED side of things, I pushed it all aside and I started on the very easy, previously mapped out paint job and took my mind off the failures by doing all of these sections. Given that I'm inspired by and not a direct one-to-one paint job of the Panzer you see in the toys in the anime, I gave myself some liberties to play with and I changed it very slightly. As is tradition with my Zoids builds, I turned to SMS Paints for the good stuff and Professor Scotty had exactly what I needed. For the base undercoat, before the base paint went on, I opted to just full sand it with jet black over everything because I had excess of it and it was there. With the exclusion of the gold and the white base zero pieces, and this was to fully lean into the darker end result that I've had mentally brewing this whole time, because a 2-second look at basically everything I do on this channel and it's usually pretty dark. A quick glance at the Panzer and you'll see it's basically 2 shades of green, some gold, white, red and grey, and that's exactly what I was going to do, but with less flair, and that meant the airbrushing stage was important to get right. Olive drab for the green colours was perfect for what I was aiming for, so using PL152 and PL167, I dove on in and lightly built it up along the appropriate panels, leaving it darker at the edges and features because I really wanted to return later and weather it like an AFV that had been in service for a very long time, or rather post-service even, perhaps leaning towards ready to be scrapped, and I knew it was going to pop really well. Up next, I was eyeing up some of the grey and blue pieces from the base zero, and I really wanted to use PMT06 steel on this build because I sneaked that into absolutely everything. So I did, and I can't say that I regret my choice because it really does lend itself to that heavy machine look of the Panzer and just blends nicely. But to not really overuse it, I split off some of these grey pieces and did them with PMT20 lead. And that's another really good looking metal colour, I feel, and it does exceptionally well with this chunky boyo. Moving on to the golds, I used a couple, one being an older SMS colour that I'm not really sure you can get anymore, but that's rich gold from the advanced range. And that was thinned down for airbrushing use of course, and I feel it fits the bill really nicely where the hydraulics and shock absorbers are concerned. Looking at the teeth and claw covers, I actually managed to stop myself once guys. I didn't use old gold. I know, crazy right? But here I thought PMT14 Inca would look nice, trying to imagine how the various golds looked against the other colours at the end when weathered. Was actually very tricky, I gotta say. Moving on, I settled with using PL130 or German Sand Yellow as the base for the lightly built up PL132 German Cream, and that's to set the stage for the older look, making it look more yellowed, you know, as white tends to go. This is really fun to paint, so I'm probably gonna try and do a Zoid like all over like this in the future. Who knows, but I'd say PL181 Dunkel Brown would probably marry up really nicely with this idea, considering I used it on a few bits here and there. Finally, with the stabilizers or spinny bits, and that was very much a blast with some form of red over the top of jet black, if I was a guessing man. I'd also say it's probably PL52 wine red, along with some sort of grey I used on the underbody pieces, maybe being German grey mixed with the lighter shade, but I can't confirm that because I actually didn't write it down, so sorry. Shifting on to do some building, the whole kit had to be kind of built backwards or out of order, basically with the furthest points like the head, the tail, the cannons, things like that all coming first. And that was because I needed to feed the cabling between all of the sections, like veins in the body I guess. So effectively I had to go through each section piece by piece, half lay the cable through, see what it needed to avoid, see what it could avoid, see what it kind of needed to not interrupt to make sure the kit would still go together and move, and then I'd snake it through after boring out sections, I guess. Along with all of the out-of-place assembly sections were the missile pods and the packs, and basically the entire build was just one big jumbled up mess with cables everywhere that I had to sit and figure out as it went along. And it really sucks that some areas of the lights ended up not functioning correctly, but there's a silver lining to this. So basically, some of them simply died a few minutes after running, despite being tested and working, you know, every step of the way. Some of them just fizzled out and shut off, which I'm going to put down to shoddy quality, but it's all okay, I guess, because the ones that do work, especially with missing one of the barrel cannon light sets on the left-hand side, I think that looks good, in my opinion. It looks like it lends itself to the worn, you know, busted machine idea. Perhaps this machine is basically ready for the scrap heap, like I mentioned earlier. So while we're talking about it, the next step during assembly was the weathering, and that was when the Panzer was basically put together in sections, and this was before it was put onto the base, of course, you know, because it'd be more of a pain in the butt to get to everything while it was stuck. Given that I was loosely basing this location for the base off a place here in Queensland, Australia called Mullins Gully at Tinninbar, basically it's a river that flows from / to the sea, where I used to fish and go exploring on holidays as a young lad, and I felt like saltwater aging on the Panzer was going to fit it really nicely. So a lot of the rust and the wear was caked on, and I really let it get into the panel lines and recesses and let it sit for days to ensure that it really stuck itself in there well. And all of the weathering bits and pieces here were by AK Interactive, which can be picked up in little kits if you're interested. So like, you know, rusted AFV, stuff like that, like muddy tracks, you know, grime. You can get them in little kits. So if you really want to get in there in detail and weather Zoid like you would an AFV or a tank or something, you know, like you could just pick one of those up. Feeding all of the veins through a series of holes on the base where the pores were going, the Panzer was secured in the base with a big chunk of AV56, and the work on the terrain began using styrene and thinners and lumps for the sandbanks either side. Basically to give it a good basis. Again, leaving the styrene to fully dry, I then moved on to the forbidden porridge that was going to get caked atop the layers of the styrene, being made up of PVA and MDF particle dust, which you're going to need to wear a mask for if you do the same. This layering process takes quite a time to let the mixture fully dry, so I left the whole thing in our sunny room by the window to help speed it up with heat. When I came back to the workbench with it all, the sandy riverbed was started, with AK Interactive's terrain premixes being used here, resulting in what can only be described as a forbidden cake base, with the little pebbles that I added in acting as sprinkles, I guess. When it was all dried, some train scale logs and trees were placed here and there, along with some vines to make it look like seaweed, before pouring several layers of AK water gel in thin amounts to seal it all in anticipation for the resin pours was done. The pours themselves, I've actually never really done before, let alone any of this water stuff, so it was all just mucking about and toying, I guess you'd say. I know I wanted a deep coloured water with like a bluey-green tint to match the waters at Tinninbar, so that was done with a mix of blue-green being added to the resin mixture before the pour. Only very sparingly added, of course, and this helped it actually give it a bit of a slightly murky look, which I did like, because with a big machine in a river like this, of course it's going to stir up the sand and, you know, all that stuff. Once I had reached the top layers, the gel water made a return and was chopped up by the airflow of an empty airbrush to make it look disturbed for the seafoam areas I wanted to have a bit of a play with. While I was working on that, I went back to the sandbanks once again for some more work, which eventually, when I was satisfied, ended up being sanded all around to reduce the overhang on the actual base. And then with the completed sanding, I mustered up, smashed on some layers of gloss enamel black to give it, you know, a bit of a classy look, I guess, to then come back later, mask off the gloss, and give the terrain a stopping line. Finally, some North African sand pigment was added for the beach sand, and I added a little colour and some palm trees, which, funny enough, ended up looking like a spot in a game called Arcade, being Soulless Headlands, so it looks like that place in the game, which is pretty neat. All in all, I did teach myself a lot here, and there's a lot of things that I learnt by experimenting with things that failed, and I think it's all very okay to fail and learn from it, which is what this whole thing was about. And as big as this project is, I think it's a good stepping stone to the one that I believe is going to be a lot harder down the line. So I'm glad that I tried things with this first. It's a shame that some of the LEDs dropped, but I didn't think that it hurt the feeling of the whole picture too badly. It is what it is, but for now it's time to continue tinkering with the D-Bison that I've been teasing idly here and there. Hopefully you enjoyed this workshop experiment, so until the next one, happy modelling and take care.